Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlawn Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlawn Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome to this edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your host today, Steve Francisco, and it's a real pleasure for me to welcome a return visitor to our stage, the Chief of the Eagan Police Department, Chief Jim McDonald. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here and to meet you again.
Thank you. Let's jump right into it because I think for a lot of our viewers, they really don't know very much about the Eagan Police Department. So let's start with some basics if we could. How big is the Eagan Police Department? How many officers do you have under your command?
We have 69 sworn, and we have 16 non-sworn personnel that support the organization. They answer the phones, they type the police reports, they catch the dogs. And you know, I should say, and plug in for the organization now, it was founded in 1965, and we're going to be coming up here on our 50th anniversary here in
And let's see, I don't know, what would the population of Eagan been in 1965?
Well, I think about 4,000 people.
And now it's over 60,000,
Yes,
right?
I think we're approaching 67,000.
So how does the size of our police department here in Eagan compare to similar sized cities in Minnesota? Any idea about that?
We are probably a little understaffed. The average of officers per 1,000 people is how they gauge strength from department to department. For cities our size, it's probably around 1.2 officers per 1,000 people. We're about 1 officer per 1,000 people, and I'm certainly not complaining. I think our staff does a good job of keeping crime in check in the community. So if you hadn't nailed me down, we're a little soft on our staffing, but nothing that I'm concerned about.
And for a person to become an officer in the Eagan Police Department, give us a sense of what requirements you look for in hiring new police officers.
Well, I will say our hiring process is very competitive. As an example, we just hired 2 officers and we received over 250 applications for those 2 positions. The minimum requirements are you need a 4-year college degree in criminal justice, and then you have to go through the state sponsors, what they call academy or skills program. Once you complete those, you're eligible to be hired by a police department. We go a step further. We're looking for people that have volunteered, that have showed their commitment to others, and have established a strong track record in some sort of service.
And you have to go through, I would imagine, a fairly extensive background check, right? A criminal background check, checking person's character.
Yes. The screening process is pretty regimented. In law enforcement is one of the few positions where you can actually give a conditional offer based upon the successful completion of a psychological exam, a thorough background investigation, a medical exam, drug test, and physical agility test. If regarding the background process, we've had candidates that have applied here from Arizona, from California, from Florida, and we've actually put people on planes, put investigators on planes to go to those locations to make sure that the candidate is who they say they are. I would say, you know, police work is very labor intensive, probably like any sort of government work, but we need people that have demonstrated integrity, that always do the right thing when no one's looking. And the best way we can weed that out is to go and talk to former employees, fellow employees, former employers, old neighbors, old friends, those sorts of people to help us weed out.
This may be a somewhat sensitive question, but I'm kind of curious. We've seen a number of stories in the news recently about payouts for alleged police misconduct up in Minneapolis and occasionally in St. Paul, too. Have there been allegations against any police officers in Eagan in recent years that you're aware of that have resulted in payouts for misconduct?
We have not had any payouts for misconduct. I will say, law enforcement, it's a tricky business. We're out to arrest offenders. So we kick a lot of rocks, so to speak, and see what crawls out from underneath it. Oftentimes we have to put our hands on people, and they don't want to go to jail, and we have to wrestle with them, and it generates complaints for the officers. Now, I would say that is at a last resort when we have to actually make people. If as long as we're standing solid, on the constitutional threshold, and that we can do it, that we're empowered to do, we'll do it. And we do have a business that there's a lot of liability involved in it, but I'm happy to say we don't get sued for excessive force. I can think of one case that's actually in the works now that our tactics are questioned, but I'm very comfortable that we'll be fine.
And I know at the other side of the story, in addition, just because somebody alleges something, of course, doesn't mean that it happened. I think that the presence now of dashboard cameras in police cars and state patrol cars and law enforcement has been a tool for police departments to back up officers' versions of what happens when they have encounters with criminal suspects.
Steve, that's an excellent point. Since Rodney King, that's really was the focal point, or the main point, if you go back in history, of how video affected police work and brought out some allegations of misconduct and brought it to the top. Not only do officers have dash cams, but our officers also carry tape recorders, so they will record contact, verbal interaction.
Who said what?
Yep. Some of the tasers that the officers carry also have video on them. And I would say 9 times out of 10, if one of those video recorders are going, it works to exonerate the officer. And there really is no substitute for professional behavior.
As they say, the camera doesn't lie, and I guess the audio recorder doesn't lie either.
True.
Okay. Let's talk about crime stats. People are always interested in this subject. Tell us about Eagan. What do the crime stats tell us about the level of criminality in our city, serious crimes?
I would say if you look at our crime statistics, and you can find them online, if you go to the city website, look at the police page, you'll be able to hunt and peck on the website and find our publication, our annual report. And it profiles the crime statistics for the last 10 years. I'm happy to say our crime has been on a downhill trend. If you compare 2012 to 2011, crime was pretty flat. We showed a small decrease in violent crime and a little less than 1%. And then for non-violent crime, we showed like a 5% decrease. So very good. Our number of arrests are down maybe 14%, which is also a good sign. So Eagan,
I was going to ask you that earlier, Jim. How many people were arrested in Eagan, say, during the past year? Just rough figure, if you know that.
about 1,400.
And what's the most common offense that the Eagan police effect an arrest for?
Theft.
Theft?
Yep. Theft is probably the most prevalent crime in Eagan. If you look at our annual report, you'll see our top 10, what we characterize as calls for service. In Eagan last year, we had over 48,000 calls for service. And to explain what that is every time we do something for a citizen, if we investigate a crime, if we write a traffic ticket, if we warn someone, if we attend an accident.
If someone calls 911 or the non-emergency number too?
Right. As long as if they call dispatch and it generates a response or a need for us to respond, that's a call for service. So if you look at our top 10 calls for service, the only crime in there listed is theft. Police do many more things for our society than just investigate crimes. We go to medical emergencies in Eagan. We attend traffic accidents. We go to alarms.
I actually had personal experience with how good your department is and how responsive they were. A couple of years ago, my wife got up in the middle of the night, unknown to me because I had headsets on and was listening to music, and she fell down a flight of stairs in our home and broke her foot. And she actually fainted after that, which kind of alarmed me. I thought, are we dealing with a more serious emergency? Called 911, and Eagan police actually showed up at my door literally within 2 minutes. The officer explained that he was sitting in the parking lot of a nearby grocery store, and he got there before the paramedics did. So I was just really impressed by that.
Well, thank you, Steve, and I hope that your wife is fine.
She's doing well, yeah.
But that is the case. The police in Eagan are the first responders. We have first aid kits. We have AEDs in the squad cars. We have oxygen, and the way we have our area responsibilities set up, divided among our officers. When you call 911 in circumstances that you outlined, we can probably be to your home in about 4 minutes, less than 4 minutes.
Let's talk about guns. As we're aware, and many of our viewers are aware, the U.S. Congress failed to pass any changes in federal gun laws, any significant changes. Particularly, they rejected efforts to improve background checks. Nor did our state legislature. The Minnesota legislature was considering some measures on gun legislation. Isn't it a fact that if we had better background checks, they may not keep guns out of the hands of everyone who shouldn't have them, but wouldn't that help make it safer on our streets for citizens and for your police officers?
Well, let me just go back a little bit. I'll go back before that. I am not a person that gets into the sky is falling type of mentality when it comes to any issue. And I'll go back to when they first did the conceal and carry. There was a lot of questions about the streets would turn into a bloodbath because more people would be carrying guns. That has not been our experience. And I would say I was hesitant when that was coming through. Is that, boy, we can't be doing this. I was on that bandwagon. But the results have shown that it hasn't been an issue, and it hasn't been an issue for the Eagan Police Department. Since Sandy Hook, and actually before Sandy Hook, where no one can argue that there was a mental health component to Sandy Hook. And one thing that is troublesome to me is the inability of being able to keep firearms out of the hands of people that have some sort of mental illness. And I don't know what needs to be done to close that loophole, but there has been a proliferation of guns, in my estimation, and I'll base this on the number of permits to purchase guns that our police department by statute has to process.
Right.
And as an example, in 2011, at the end of 2011, we processed probably about 499 applications. At the end of 2012, we processed almost 800. Okay, a big increase. But again, we have not seen any more gun violence on the streets. Okay, these are by and large law-abiding people that are trying to purchase guns. But the problem that we're struggling with, and I'm going to go back to, is trying to identify the people with a mental health component. And one last point I'd like to make, and this is a real life example. We had a subject who has a mental health component that it wasn't as clear if we should deny the person or not, but we denied the person anyway. And what the whole idea is, I'm not going to give you a gun permit. If the judge or district court wants you to have the gun, they can order me to give it to you, give you a permit, but I'm not going to issue it. So,
okay. Your colleague, Dakota County Sheriff Dave Bellows, was a guest on this program a couple of weeks ago, and I interviewed him, and he pointed out something that I thought was very interesting, what he sees as a loophole in Minnesota's background check law, that if you have a history of mental illness or commitment by a state court to a mental health treatment program, that would show up if you went to apply to purchase a gun in Minnesota. But if you went to private practice for mental health treatment, that doesn't show up. And he was suggesting that that's an area that the Minnesota legislature ought to take a look at next session and ought to do something to close that loophole. Would you agree?
I would agree, wholeheartedly agree. And you know, there is in our process for doing these checks or approving these permits, you send a fax off to the Minnesota Department of Health, and they'll send you a yay or a nay back if there's been any contact with that person. And you can do that, but you know darn well that they've seen a mental health professional, and you've been told that by relatives or friends or whatever that would say, don't give Joe Smith a gun permit. So that is a loophole that does need to be closed.
Let's move on from guns if we could. Unfortunately, when you talk to law enforcement, a lot of these are really difficult, painful issues for people. Let's talk about drugs. As we're sitting here today, it's June 7th, the Star Tribune had a front page story this morning reporting that there have been 15 heroin deaths in Hennepin, Dakota, and Scott counties so far this year, related to heroin overdoses. They also reported the amount of heroin seized across Minnesota increased by 78% from 2010 to 2011. Are you seeing this on the streets in Eagan? Do we have a heroin problem in our community too?
We have users, people in our community that are using heroin. If memory serves me correctly, last year we had 2 or possibly even 3 overdoses where people died related to heroin. That's still, it's on the rise, but I think marijuana is still the drug of choice by most people in our community.
And you have some concerns too about the presence of synthetic marijuana that's showing up in our communities?
Yes, we've had some experience with that too, Steve. And I don't know the science behind this, but the people that seem to be using the synthetic marijuana, they seem to be acting out more against law enforcement. I don't know how to put my finger on that, but those...
But a sense that you have.
Yeah, they seem to be more violent than someone that's smoking marijuana or simply intoxicated due to alcohol.
Domestic violence. There have also been a number of stories in the news. We've had, 5 or 6 terrible cases in Minnesota of boyfriends or spouses who have murdered their other spouse, usually the husband murdering the woman, or at least they've been accused of this. What priority does the Eagan Police Department put on the enforcement of no-contact orders that are issued by courts to protect people from domestic violence?
When we confront someone that has, or contact someone who has a no-contact order against them, it's a shall arrest. The police have no discretion.
They're required by statute.
They're required by statute to take that person into custody. I would say that there is a lot of, there's more information available now, and more readily available now regarding no-contact orders. They attach the existence of a no-contact order to driver's license data and those sorts of things. Whereas before you used to have to rely upon someone to tell you that there was a no-contact order or an order for protection or something. So although it's a concerning problem, that these orders need to exist anyway, the crux or maybe the silver lining in this is it's a much more easier for a law enforcement officer to become aware of their existence where they can take action.
And Jim, is that part of a statewide database? So let's say that the no contact order is issued in Hennepin County, but the person may have moved to Eagan and is living in the city of Eagan, and someone violates a no contact order that was issued in Hennepin County. Does your department, you're able to see that information? It shows up?
If we run the driver's license data, it'll show there'll be a no contact order in effect.
Okay.
And there is another database that's sponsored by the state. It's called Odyssey that the officers have access to. So they can uncover that information.
Good. Sexual predators. 1996, Minnesota passed a law which basically created 3 levels, level 1, 2, and 3, 3 being the most serious, for people who had been convicted of sexual offenses and were now living in the community, so to speak. They were done serving their time. How many sexual predators do we have living in the Eagan community at last count? And do we have any level 3 offenders living in our community?
We currently have 1 level 3 predatory offender living in the city. Lives off of Diffley and Ron Road. That information, we post the names of our sexual predators, and they're actually called predatory offenders.
Okay.
But you can find them on the police website. And go on the police page and you'll see a link to predatory offenders. There's a host of information there available as a resource for anyone that's wanting to know how to keep themselves safe. But in regards to your question about how many predatory offenders that we have, I'm going to say 70 to 80, somewhere in there. And keep in mind, that predatory offender law, that notification law, has evolved over time. Every offender that we have living in Eagan may not be assigned a risk level. Okay, so prior to the year, the 97,
96, I think
96
it was, yeah.
that you mentioned, offenders just need to register. They were not assigned a risk level upon their release from prison.
And so the 3 levels, as you get to the higher level, to level 3, that is what gives the police the authority to release more information to the public about that individual?
Exactly. And I would say even level 2s, depending upon what their offense is, and if you look at their history and their likelihood to reoffend, if the police can justify a broader notification, we can do that. And I have done that in some circumstances.
Does having a higher designation, say a 2 or 3, lead the Eagan police to conduct greater surveillance on that individual or their neighborhood? I mean, it seems like there's a tricky issue here because we have to balance civil liberties concerns when a person has done their time and served a sentence, but we can't arrest people in anticipation of crimes that they might commit in the future. But with level 3 offenders, the data seems clear that a lot of them seem predisposed to be recidivists and recommit crime. So how do you balance that out as a police officer?
That's tricky. There's an interest. It's in everyone's best interest to have the offender succeed in society. But you balance that against a group of neighbors that have young children in the neighborhood that might have some legitimate concerns, and based on the offender's history, they could be well-deserved concerns. What we try to do when we have our community notification meetings with level 3s is we provide information because we feel information truly is power. We are a resource for anyone that has any questions about the presence of a predatory offender in the neighborhood. We early on will provide extra patrol in those neighborhoods. We'll contact schools. We try to draw in our partners that have an equal stake in this offender living in the community. So,
and the information that you release about predatory offenders, you're not releasing names and addresses, or are you?
Level 3 predatory offender information is public data. So we don't release the exact address, but we'll release the block, the hunt, and the name in the street of where the person is.
And again,
is
the
living.
purpose of this, it's not to encourage people to go out and be vigilantes or take the law into their own hands. It's to be alert and aware of their surroundings and people in their community. Fair statement?
Exactly. We don't need the public to police.
They need to leave that to you.
They leave that to us, and that is something that we talk about at our community notification meetings.
Okay. The U.S. Supreme Court issued a big decision at the end of the term regarding DNA evidence, and the decision basically says now that police do not need a warrant to collect DNA evidence from somebody who's arrested, which has raised some concerns, especially on the court. The court was very divided. It was a 5-4 decision, But it was interesting this time, Justice Scalia, who's probably the most conservative member of the court, lined up with several of the court's more liberal members in dissent, saying they were raising concerns about police and government authorities creating DNA database of everybody who gets arrested, regardless of whether they're subsequently charged or convicted of a crime. Is the Eagan Police Department going to start taking DNA samples from everyone that you arrest?
Well, first of all, Minnesota has a more stringent standard that we'll have to adhere to. I mean, Minnesota's constitution is more stringent, which they can do. And right now, in Minnesota, you can only collect DNA evidence with a search warrant or upon the charge of some offenses, and I can't name them for you right now.
Okay.
But I'd like to remind your viewers, when someone is arrested now, we do take fingerprints, and that actually, that is pretty intrusive, probably more intrusive than sticking a swab in someone's.
Pretty reliable way of identifying people.
And,
too,
and you stick a DNA swab or a Q-tip in someone's cheek and put it in an envelope, and that's really it. And I would say a lot of crimes are solved because of DNA evidence. It's new. I think there is a public interest and a public safety interest to collect DNA. I don't know how it'll shape out in Minnesota if we'll accept a more liberal standard.
In light of the court decision?
In light of the court decision. But,
okay.
Frankly, I'd like to see it because I think it would do better, do wonders for public safety.
Real quick question. We're down to our last 2 minutes, Jim. Question about driving issues. Driving safety is always a concern for the Eagan Police Department. Seems like we see a lot of people on the road who are distracted. They're talking on their cell phones, handheld phones. They're dialing numbers. They're texting, which my understanding is that's against the law in the state of Minnesota and most other states now. You can't be driving and texting. Are your officers issuing a lot of tickets for these offenses these days? And what would you say to our community about doing these things when you're driving?
Well, texting in your car is very pervasive, and I would say from a law enforcement standpoint, it's like draining the ocean with a spoon. Everybody has a cell phone now that they pull out and they're texting. I've seen it myself and stop and warn. I can't sit here and tell you that our officers are tagging a lot of people for that offense, but we are aware of it, and actually texting is probably more dangerous than drunk driving right now.
Down to our last few seconds here, Jim. I want to, before we let you go today, talk about National Night Out. What is that, and when is it?
Well, it's August 6th, first Tuesday in August. Very excited about it. We anticipate having 150 parties. It's a good partnership between the community and the Eagan Citizens Crime Prevention Association. So turn on your lights, lock your doors, go out and meet your neighbors.
Go to your neighborhood gathering.
Yep.
And I should say, I've done this. My wife and I do this every year. It's a great opportunity. Get together, have some good food. Your officers have come to our association every year, and so does the Eagan Fire Department, too.
Yep.
So it's a great way to get to know your neighbors, too.
I was remiss. Our good friends at the Eagan Fire Department are participate in this.
Winding up here. Well, we've just about run out of time. Jim, we'll have to have you back on to talk further. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure.
Right.